Here's a number: 105 years. That's more than a century of unbroken institutional memory, longer than cars have been mass market.
That's how long Save the Children ran its most famous fundraising program for.
105 years through world wars, the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the internet, 9/11, 105 years of letters and photographs of a donor in Washington looking at a picture of a child in Mali on their refrigerator, feeling like they knew her. And in some way, they did.
And then in 2025, they retired it after 105 years.
And here's the twist.
There's always a twist.
Save the Children helped to pioneer individual child sponsorship. It built an entire fundraising empire on the emotional power of a direct, personal, one-to-one connection between a donor and a specific child. Except the connection was more complicated than it looked. The children were real. The letters were real. But the financial relationship that the donor imagined, your money, that child, was not. And figuring out exactly what was real, what wasn't, and why it took 105 years to change is one of the most revealing business model stories in the history of the nonprofit sector.
And in September 2025, when they finally stopped, they won an award for it, an Innovation Award, for retiring a program they've been running for over a century.
And that's Save the Children, one of the most important organizations in the world, and now 107 years old, older than most democracies, with a reach of 115 countries.
With an annual budget of $1 billion a year, it's not a charity in the small sense. It's a large multinational entity with a social mission and a business model that is, right now, under more stress than at any point in its history, for reasons that have nothing to do with the sponsorship story and everything to do with a single executive order signed on January 20th, 2025.
So today we're tracing how a woman arrested in London's Trafalgar Square built something that reached 113 million children in a single year. That's equivalent to about the population of all of Egypt. So what were the funding models that made this possible? Which ones were brilliant, which were troubled, and which one was hiding a structural vulnerability that nearly everyone could see and nobody fixed?
And what comes next? Because the answer to that question for Save the Children and for the whole sector matters more right now than it has in decades.
And a quick disclaimer before we dive in: Impact is produced for informational and entertainment purposes. Nothing here is financial, legal, or professional advice of any kind. The views are ours alone.
We fact-check everything against primary sources and will correct mistakes. So please tell us if you catch something. We're not affiliated with, endorsed by, or sponsored by any of the organizations we cover.
I'm Revi Sterling.
And I'm Melissa Stern. And this is Impact.
What we're going to push on today, beyond the origin story, because the origin story is wonderful, is the business model question underneath all of it. Is what Save the Children has been doing actually sustainable? Is SCGV, their new impact investing arm, a real second engine or a press release? And what does it mean that the organization's entire crisis response in 2025 was featured in the Harvard Business Review?
Right, that HBR piece is quite interesting. You know, the CEO wrote it herself.
She did, which tells you something. When your nonprofit's crisis management strategy gets published in the Business School Journal, you've either done something impressive or something worth interrogating.
The through line across all funding models that we'll look at is the same question. What money exists in the world that hasn't yet been pointed at children?
Let's start at the beginning. April 1919. Eglantine Jebb, who's an Oxford educator, former school teacher, is in London's Trafalgar Square handing out leaflets calling attention to starving children in post-war Europe. The war has been over since November, but the Allied blockade is still on.
Just to be clear about what that blockade was actually doing, Britain and its allies were maintaining an economic stranglehold on Germany and Austria as leverage to force the peace terms. Children were the most visible casualties. 10 to 12 million children in Central Europe, that's about the size of greater LA metropolitan area, were malnourished or at serious risk in the immediate post-World War I years, with several million in Austria alone.
And Jebb's leaflets were blunt. They said essentially, our blockade has caused this. Millions of children are starving. That message was illegal under something called the Defense of the Realm Act, DORA, which banned public criticism of government policy. And she was arrested, put on trial, and convicted.
Okay, and here's the part that's almost too perfect. The prosecutor, the man who had just secured her conviction, reached into his pocket and handed her £5 to pay her fine.
The man who helped put her in front of a judge gave her the money to walk out.
£5, that's about $300 in today's money, equivalent to about a week's skilled wages then, plus a spontaneous collection at the Royal Albert Hall meeting that followed. And all that became the seed capital of Save the Children. The organization literally started with money from the person who had just tried to stop it. How cool is that? And if that doesn't tell you something about how funding works when a cause is compelling enough, I don't know what does.
By the end of 1919, 8 months in, about 5 million in 19 tens of millions today, it was enough to mount a large-scale international relief operation, but still small relative to the scale of the millions of malnourished children in Central Europe at the time. Two things about the founding model are worth noting as business observations.
First of all, it was meant to be temporary. Save the Children was not set up as a permanent institution. The plan was to respond to the post-war emergency and then dissolve.
This is what was supposed to happen to UNICEF as well. The organizations that ended up changing the world are often the ones that keep failing to shut down because the problems refuse to stop.
Yeah, and Jeb's fundraising was ahead of her time. Save the Children became one of the first charities in the UK to use full-page newspaper ads. Not a classified notice, a real full page. And that was in 1919. And then the Vatican.
And that is because the Archbishop of Canterbury told her no.
Right. After the Archbishop told her no, because he didn't think appropriate to get involved with what he considered to be a political organization, Jeb did what any reasonable person would do. She wrote to the Pope instead. She drafted a formal appeal, got 14 eminent people to sign it, and went to Rome in person. And then, before she even got into the meeting, she spent most of her time sprinting down a Vatican corridor, chasing the wrong man.
And you found there's actually a letter home to her mother about this. She'd been kept waiting, and then suddenly a Vatican emissary arrived, shouting in Italian, and she could only make out the word "come," and set off at a run down a long corridor, his purple robes billowing behind him. And she described chasing this figure who looked like a purple bouncing ball. And then at the end of the corridor, she saw a figure standing quietly alone and remembered too late that popes wear white and not purple.
She'd been sprinting after the messenger.
The Pope actually kept her there for 2 hours, contributed £25,000 of his own personal money, and directed Catholic churches around the world to collect for the fund on Holy Innocents' Day, just December 28th. There's an existing feast day in the Christian calendar, and it commemorates the killing of children by King Herod under his attempt to find the infant Jesus. The Pope chose the day of children being killed by a paranoid ruler to fundraise for children being starved by governments making a political calculation. The parallel was not lost on anyone.
And when the Archbishop of Canterbury heard what the Pope had agreed to and personally contributed, he didn't want to seem like the bad guy. The Church of England came on board, then other faith groups. What Jeb had essentially done was unlock competitive social signaling among the churches, one of the oldest fundraising mechanisms there is.
And the Vatican's parish infrastructure in 1919 is basically the original franchise model, and Jeb figured out how to activate it in an afternoon.
The organization also spread internationally almost immediately. A Swedish sister organization called Rädda Barnen, which means Save the Children in Swedish, was founded the same year. In January 1920, Jeb helped create an international Save the Children Union in Geneva. The federation model, independent national organization sharing a common mission, was built from day one.
Which turned out to be both the organization's greatest asset and one of its most persistent headaches, but we'll get there.
Jeb died in 1928 at the age of 52 in Geneva of a thyroid condition. But what she left behind was a rights philosophy, a fundraising model built on moral clarity and public spectacle, and a declaration of children's rights that the League of Nations adopted in 1924. And that became the foundation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, the most universally accepted human rights treaty in history.
Except the U.S. remains the only UN member state that hasn't ratified it.
Yep. Which, given everything that happened to Save the Children's U.S. government funding in 2025, is particularly a sharp irony. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, child sponsorship. This is the part of the Save the Children story that the more you understand it, the more your head spins.
Because Save the Children didn't just popularize child sponsorship. They helped to pioneer it beginning around 1920, right at the founding. The basic mechanism: identify a specific child, give a donor a photograph, a name, a story, and encourage correspondence. That personal connection unlocks money that an appeal abstract never could. Give to children in Europe is vague, but give to Maria, 9 years old, from Vienna, who wants to be a teacher but is hungry, is concrete.
I did some research on Malcolm Burrows, who has written extensively on sponsorship as a fundraising mechanism. He describes what child sponsorship was designed to do: unstranger the beneficiary. Create make a donor feel that a specific child is, in some ways, theirs. And it worked. Other organizations adopted it almost immediately. Foster Parents Plan in 1937, Child Fund in 1938, and Plan International. By the 2020s, child sponsorship industry-wide was generating somewhere between $3 and $5 billion a year.
So let's walk through what actually happened when someone signed up to sponsor a child through Save the Children, because this is where the story gets complicated. You'd pay a monthly fee, in recent years about $36 to $39 a month in the U.S., and that's what, a few cappuccinos a week. You'd receive a welcome kit with a photo and information about a specific, named, real child. The child is real and is enrolled in a Save the Children program in a real community. You could write letters, and some would be translated and delivered. You might even get letters back. Save the Children said in some cases you could even visit the country or community.
So I don't get it. The child is real, the letters are real, the visits are possible. What's the complication?
The money, because your $36 a month did not go to that child or their family. Save the Children was clear about this, eventually, in their own disclosures. Here's their language verbatim. Your sponsorship contributions are not directly given to a child. Instead, your contributions are pooled with those from other sponsors to provide community-based programming for all eligible children in the area.
So let me get this straight. The child on my fridge, one whose letters I keep in a shoebox, that relationship is genuine, right?
Genuinely yours. Save the Children matched you to a specific child. That child wrote to you or someone helped them write to you. The connection was real. What wasn't real was the financial one-to-one. Your money went into a shared pool, which funded schools and health programs and community infrastructure for all the children in the area, including your child, but alongside the children of every other donor in that community.
Which actually, I don't know, does that really make sense from a development standpoint? Community investment is more effective than singling out one child in a village.
And that's exactly the defense Save the Children makes, and there's substance to it. But notice the gap between what the product implied and what the product delivered. A 2018 study found that 54% of child sponsorship donors believed it was mostly a gimmick, like half the room suspecting the story behind the product wasn't the whole story. And 3 out of 4 believed the money didn't really go to one child. So even most believers understood the model was more emotional than literal.
So donors more or less knew and gave anyway. And Save the Children knew that they knew.
There's a philosophy for that in fundraising. David Rudman describes it as a tension between creating the psychological experience of connection that raised money and the realities of fighting poverty. The Christian Science Monitor documented the gap in 1981, and the Chicago Tribune ran a major investigation in 1998. These weren't secrets, but fundamentally nothing changed. The model ran for another quarter century after the Tribune piece.
Okay, but what about when someone actually came to visit? If the financial relationship wasn't direct, what happened when a donor showed up in person?
Save the Children's own language is telling. They said donors could visit the country or community to see the impact of their support firsthand. Note that they said the country or community, not your child. Because if you arrived, you were visiting a village whose programs the pooled contributions of dozens of sponsors had built. Your specific child might be there, but the school, the clinic, the training, those came from collective funds. The one-to-one was the relationship, and the many-to-community was the money. Now, here's where it gets poignant. The Abdul Kone story.
That's the Chicago Tribune story.
Yes, that's the one where the Tribune spent a year investigating Save the Children in 1998. The sharpest example involved a family in Bellingham, Washington, the Dixons, who had been sponsoring a boy named Abdul Kone from Mali for nearly 6 years. His photograph was on their refrigerator. They handled his letters with loving care. But Abdul had died in a donkey cart accident, and for nearly 4 years after his death, the correspondence kept coming.
4 years of letters from a child who had been dead for 4 years.
So one Mali-based employee was dismissed, 3 were reprimanded, and the story was framed as an administrative failure in a remote field office, which it was. But it was also the logical endpoint of a model where the emotional relationship between donor and child was the entire product. When maintaining that relationship, even artificially, served the fundraising engine, the incentive to let it continue was built into the structure. The scandal didn't change the structure. The model ran for another 27 years.
Okay, so what changed in 2025?
A few things converged. In 2020, Save the Children launched a multi-year global review. Communities, country office staff, donors, and most importantly, the children themselves. And what they heard from the children was uncomfortable. Save the Children's own internal evidence showed that running sponsorship was already generating feelings of abandonment and exclusion, not when it ended, but while it ran. Non-sponsored children in the same communities watched their peers receive gifts and letters. The organization's own COO said children who didn't receive replies from sponsors felt rejected. Disparities in gifts led to feelings of jealousy.
So the problem wasn't just that 80% of sponsors weren't regularly writing back to their adopted children, though that's kind of striking on its own. It was that the architecture of the program itself was creating a 2-tier community, the children with sponsors and the children without.
Right. And in 2025, Save the Children ended the letter writing service as part of a winding down of a program entirely. The replacement is called Team Tomorrow, a monthly giving program where donors choose a cause, not a child.
What did the donors say about that?
Well, the donors weren't angry about the money. They were angry about the relationship. Richard Barlow, a financial services lawyer in Surrey who had been corresponding since 2020 with a Bangladeshi teenager named Mahim, who was a sparky young chap who wanted to become a doctor, received an instruction from Save the Children to write a goodbye letter, with the caveat in their exact words, "We will do our best to deliver it to the child. There is no guarantee of a reply."
No guarantee of a reply? From the organization that had been facilitating your correspondence for 5 years?
So Barlow wrote to the charity and asked, how do they propose explaining to Mahim he won't now hear from us again when the service is abruptly cut off in a week's time? He called it an absolutely disgraceful development. Another donor, David Fishwick, wrote, when I received the letter informing me of the changes, it made no mention of the possible effects on the children who were being sponsored.
So here's the paradox. Donors were worried that ending sponsorship would make children feel abandoned. And Save the Children's internal review found that running sponsorship had already been making non-sponsored children in the same communities feel left out. The program generated feelings of abandonment, whether it ran or stopped.
The critics of ending it and the critics who argued for ending it were both completely right. The personal relationship was real and valuable, and running it at scale, incompletely, with 80% of sponsors not writing back regularly, was causing harm to the children it didn't reach. Save the Children's employee who spoke with donors put it carefully. Children themselves see these contributions as highly beneficial, but they also see a little bit of an exclusionary sense to some children receiving letters and support and some children who aren't.
And here's the thing about evidence. There were also rigorous studies on whether child sponsorship actually worked.
The most important ones, a 2013 Journal of Political Economy study and a 2017 World Bank Economic Review paper, tracked more than 10,000 formerly sponsored adults across 6 countries and found large, statistically significant positive impacts on education, employment, and adult income.
So does the evidence support child sponsorship?
With an important caveat. Those studies were conducted entirely through Compassion International, which does do genuine one-to-one individual sponsorship. that money actually goes to that specific child. The same 2017 paper explicitly classified Save the Children as community-centered and noted that the less targeted nature of these programs renders potential impacts more diffuse and thus more difficult to assess. Save the Children could not claim the benefits of that evidence base because they were running a fundamentally different model than the one in the studies measured.
They got the fundraising power of the individual sponsorship idea without being able to claim the evidence that justified it.
And that's the tension in one sentence. And in September 2025, after 105 years, they received the Blackbaud Impact Changemaker Award specifically for retiring the model, an innovation award for stopping something they'd been running for over a century.
Yep.
The award is for the organizational courage to walk away from an 100-year revenue mechanism with enormous institutional momentum. That takes real nerve, but it's still ironic. Before we leave sponsorship, there's one more chapter that needs to be discussed in the story.
The U.S. angle.
Yes, the U.S. Save the Children was founded in 1932 during the Depression, and it focused initially on Appalachian children in Kentucky. It was very domestic. And as the Cold War heated up, the child sponsorship picked up a second purpose most donors had no idea about. In 2014, historian Sarah Fieldson published in Diplomatic History that American child sponsorship agencies, including Save the Children, sought to forge international friendships that would support U.S. political alliances. Her phrase was to mold children into strong democratic citizens who would join the fight against communism.
Ooh, the children were ideological infrastructure.
At the institutional level, yes, which in retrospect makes the later move to community development feel even more defensible. If individual sponsorship was partly functioning as soft power for American foreign policy, moving towards community development that responds to actual community needs is a more honest model.
And there's an uncomfortable thread that runs directly from there to 2025. If your organization was partly valuable to the U.S. government as ideological infrastructure during the Cold War, and that's 35 years ago? What exactly is your continued value proposition to Washington now? That question may have been lurking under the surface for much longer than anyone wanted to admit. The 50% dependency on U.S. government funding we're about to discuss didn't appear overnight. It accumulated across decades in which the political rationale for that funding was quietly shifting.
And that is a very pointed observation, and we will come back to it.
Ooh, that's a little conspiracy-ish.
Okay, but first, let's talk about the federation problem. UNICEF has national committees, and Save the Children has national members. Structurally, they're similar, autonomous entities in wealthy countries authorized to fundraise on the international brand's behalf. But the Save the Children Federation is older, larger, and for most of the 20th century, significantly less coordinated.
By the 1970s, you had a global network. UK, US, Sweden, Norway, Australia, Japan, and more. All operating under the same name, all responding to the same emergencies, and frequently getting in each other's way. Different program standards, different donor relationships, and occasionally even competing for the same government grant.
In 1979, the national organizations formed the Save the Children Alliance to coordinate. Formalized in 1997 as the International Save the Children Alliance with a permanent secretariat in London. But coordinating is not integrating.
The consolidation effort that followed is one of the most ambitious organizational transformations in NGO history. Boston Consulting Group came in pro bono. The core finding was blunt. Different national members were running alongside each other but not together. And the duplication cost enormous amounts of money that could otherwise reach children.
The new structure brought in international programs under a centralized management model headquartered in London, 20 regional offices down to 7. One strategy, one standard, one brand. National members kept their domestic fundraising function, donor relationships, government grants, corporate partnerships, and field delivery consolidated under Save the Children International.
That must have been brutal, getting the UK and the US boards to actually cede operational control to a central body took all of 2010 and into March of 2011. By every account, it was the most difficult period in the entire multi-year process.
The proof of concept came fast. In 2013, 2 years after the consolidation, Save the Children International absorbed Merlin, a major international health charity, without outside help. A merger like that would have been logistically impossible pre-consolidation.
Let's talk about the business critique, because the consolidation is presented as a success story, and in many ways it was. But what does it cost to coordinate a federation of 29 sovereign national members, even a consolidated one? You've got 29 national boards, each with their own legal status, their own donor relationships, and their own political contexts. Getting all of them to execute one strategy requires constant alignment work.
And the USAID crisis in 2025 revealed exactly where the cracks still are. When the funding freeze hit, Save the Children UK, a separate national member, cut nearly 200 staff. Save the Children International made its own set of difficult decisions. They were coordinated, but they weren't seamless. The consolidation made the organization more coherent, but it did not make it into a single entity.
What do we have today? Save the Children International and 29 national member organizations, one name, one strategy, one ambition. The consolidation took nearly a decade and required every national board to surrender meaningful authority. And just as we've seen, the sovereignty doesn't fully disappear even after the papers are signed.
Let's talk about where the money actually comes from. And I want to approach this as a business analyst, not a cheerleader.
Let's do it.
Save the Children US had close to $1 billion in contributions in fiscal year 2024. And the breakdown was that 50% came from the US government direct and pass-through funding. 24% came through individuals, 11% from the UN and other multilateral institutions, 8% from foundations, and the rest from corporate partners.
50% from a single government, which is, let's just name it, a catastrophic concentration of risk for an organization of this size and mandate.
It would be red flagged in any investment portfolio for sure. Any business with 50% of its revenue from one client, one source, one decision maker, that is not a diversified revenue model. That is a dependency.
And the question you have to ask is why? Why, after 100 plus years of operation, was an organization with this track record still 50% dependent on a single government?
Part of the answer is that U.S. government money was enormously and relatively stable for decades. USAID wasn't just a funder, it was a co-implementer. Save the Children's program footprint grew because USAID's program footprint grew. They were growing together.
Which works perfectly, until it doesn't.
Now let's set the stage for what actually happened on January 20th, 2025, because it matters.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Yanti Saripto, CEO of Save the Children US, was already in a planned retreat with her senior leadership team. They'd gathered in person to think about the year ahead. They talked about strategic priorities, the usual. And then the executive order landed. Day one of the new administration, a blanket freeze on all U.S. foreign development assistance. Not a reduction, not a phase down, a freeze, effective immediately.
While they were all in the same room.
Saripto wrote about what happened next in the Harvard Business Review. She published it herself, which is quite a notable choice. Went through every stage of grief in rapid sequence. Denial. Is it even possible for a president to deny funds appropriated by Congress? Anger. How could the administration do this? Bargaining. Could they litigate? Depression. Could they continue without the money? And then acceptance. They couldn't avoid this, but they could stay calm and navigate through it.
And crucially, she writes that they thought the cuts would be gradual. They read Project 2025. They expected reductions, but they didn't expect day one blanket immediate termination of funding that had already been appropriated by Congress.
By late February 2025, 93.5% of USAID awards and 45% of State Department grants were eliminated. Hundreds of Save the Children programs were globally effectively terminated.
Just as one example, in Somalia, they were forced to close nutrition centers, putting tens of thousands of children's lives at risk. These weren't budget adjustments. They were terminations of life-sustaining services in active crisis zones.
And then in July 2025, Congress passed a $9 billion rescissions package, the first to become law since 1999. clawing back $1.3 billion in additional humanitarian funding, despite prior assurances that life-saving programs would be exempt.
So let me ask the business critique question directly. An organization with a 170-year track record, a $1 billion annual budget operating in 115 countries, didn't have sufficient reserves or diversification to absorb a 50% revenue shock. Unfortunate, but typical of nonprofits.
Right. Nonprofits are not incentivized to hold large reserves. Charity watchdog methodology, including Charity Navigator, has historically penalized organizations for holding large cash reserves, treating it as a sign of inefficiency rather than prudence. The pressure to maximize program spending creates a structural bias against the kind of financial cushion that could absorb a shock like this.
That's a really important structural critique of how charity evaluation works. You're graded on spending your money fast, not on having enough to survive a crisis.
Second, the government funding wasn't random grant money. It was contract funding tied to specific programs in specific countries. You don't hold reserves against earmarked contracts in the way you might against unrestricted individual giving. The accounting logic makes sense within its own framework, but the framework turned out to be catastrophically fragile.
And third, and this is the most uncomfortable one, Save the Children had known this was a vulnerability for years. Academic analysis goes back a decade, flagging excessive concentration of fundraising on grants and sustained risks. They said this explicitly. The dependency wasn't a secret.
Sarepta is smart to say herself in the HBR piece, an organization of our age and size must also avoid complacency and be willing to adapt to a new normal of volatile or reduced government support. That's a CEO acknowledging in public that the old model was a form of complacency.
She also writes that her team had to learn, quote, to manage our cash flow the way a scrappy business might, which is kind of a striking thing for the CEO of a nearly billion-dollar organization to have to say, but it's also honest.
And the response was cooperation agreements with Mercy Corps and CARE, where I work, to increase collective surge capacity. If you can't replace the funding in the short term, you can coordinate to avoid duplicating overhead while shrinking programs.
Save the Children International CEO Inger Asching published a year-end piece for 2025. She said the organization was forced to close country offices, cut thousands of staff positions, and wind down life-saving operations. Her estimate was about 11.5 million people, including 6.7 million children, enough to fill thousands of schools, would feel the immediate impacts. The most tough decisions in our 105 history.
And the Federation did something notable. It announced withdrawal from UN OCHA country-based pooled funds, which are centralized humanitarian funding pools, specifically to create more space for local organizations to directly access that money. It's a principled localization decision made in the middle of a funding crisis.
Which is either admirable or it's a way of framing a forced retreat as a strategic choice.
Probably both. The best institutional decisions are often the ones that do both simultaneously. The structural lesson is the same one UNICEF taught us. A single large government donor who changes its mind can detonate your funding model. The difference is severity. For UNICEF, U.S. government was roughly 20% of total funding. For Save the Children U.S., it was 50%. That's not a bigger version of the same problem. That is categorically more dangerous exposure. Here's something most people miss. We all picture Save the Children as that photo on the fridge and letters from a kid in Kenya. It's a beautiful story. But since 2019, they've been building something completely different underneath, a second engine for the entire organization.
They call it Save the Children Global Ventures, or SCGV. And the big lesson here? When government funding can vanish overnight, which we'll get to, they need a way to tap money that traditional charity can't touch.
In 2019, Save the Children Australia launched what they called the first child-focused impact investment fund. They started with Australian $7.5 million, which is about $5 million US dollars. The money came from QBE Insurance, Australia's biggest business insurer, plus Save the Children putting up their own cash and smaller commitments from existing donors. Here's an important detail. These weren't your typical Wall Street investors expecting big payouts. Most treated this as mission-aligned giving, tax-deductible donations that get recycled into startups. But the goal was never quick profits. It was building something permanent.
Here's the simple genius of how it works. Save the Children already had massive advantages. Deep expertise in health, education, child protection, plus trusted partners in 115 countries. A startup building education software for rural Africa? By itself, that company spends years just figuring out local regulations, finding partners, and proving impact. But when Save the Children says, we know every regulator, every evidence gap, every local partner, we'll make introductions for you. That same company scales 10 times faster.
So they picked 6 early companies and invested about half their original fund. The typical deal size is about $600,000 in equity. Take Nguntu College. They're bringing education to rural Kenya. Inquisitive does EdTech. After SCGV's help, they won a $1.95 million government grant and now reach over 100,000 students. ThinkMD does remote health diagnoses where doctors can't reach. And OHO creates child protection technology. Intel School handles school management, and so on.
All right, here are the lessons from this. Lesson 1, the upside is exponential. Inquisitive alone now serves 100,000 kids. The whole portfolio claims 1.9 million children reached. Investors call it child lens investing. Their 2025 report shows $23 million mobilized across 31 countries. Tap the $500 billion to $2 trillion impact investing market, and suddenly you're playing in capital pools the size of national economies.
Lesson 2, the risks are brutal, but contained. Most startups fail. 80 to 90% don't survive 10 years. That $600,000 per deal could have bought 16,000 mosquito nets or fed 12,000 kids for a month. The whole fund is just 0.8% of their $987 million budget. The total wipeout stings, but doesn't sink them. Donors might complain, why gamble when kids are starving? Boards face pressure. Regulators could question the mission drift.
So lesson 3 is that smart controls make it work. They only invest where they have expertise: health, education, child protection. Months of due diligence, not weeks. They don't just send cash. They make introductions, navigate regulations, and help win grants. That inquisitive $1.95 million grant? SCGV leverage. And the small size means no existential threat.
What if most fail? They planned for it. The fund structure mixes equity, loans, and donor capital. There's no fixed exit pressure. It's patient capital. Australian origin plus Swiss foundation status keeps it clean from U.S. tax headaches. There's no taxes on returns because it's all mission-related. National boards signed off during their 2010s consolidation when everyone saw government funding risks coming.
Do the math. Say one company exits at 3 times return in 7 years. That $600,000 becomes $1.8 million. Reinvest. Compound at 8% for 20 years, and then you've got $6.2 million working capital, enough for 10 new deals. SCGV itself pulls about $1.9 million in revenue annually. Small, but growing.
2025 USAID cuts. When 50% of U.S. revenue disappeared overnight, that wasn't optional. The lesson? Nonprofits need second engines. SCGV risks 0.8% of budget for 10 times potential impact. It's a tiny bet with a potentially exponential reward.
Doesn't sound like charity anymore. It's business, with children at the center. Let's talk about what the organization has actually built, because the business model critique shouldn't obscure the impact reality.
Since 1990, the global under 5 mortality rate has declined by 61%, from 94 deaths per 1,000 live births to 37 in 2023. Save the Children doesn't claim sole credit. Nobody should. It's the result of 30 years of sustained, coordinated investments by governments, multilateral institutions, NGOs, health systems, and communities. But Save the Children was in the field for all of it.
Through their advocacy efforts, they helped secure nearly $4 billion in federal funding for international and U.S. nutrition and early education programs. Save the Children also functions as a policy actor, and sometimes the biggest win comes from changing the system, not from delivering the service directly.
So here's the program expense ratio, 84%. 84 cents of every dollar reaches programs. For comparison, World Vision runs around 89%, UNICEF USA at 88%. Save the Children is on the efficient end of an already efficient peer group.
I want to push on this efficiency ratio question because I think it matters more than most people realize. Those ratios, the metric the charity watchdog world has essentially enshrined as the primary measure of nonprofit quality, may actually have contributed to the very vulnerability we've been discussing. If you're spending 84 cents of every dollar on programs, then you're not building reserves. You're not investing in revenue diversification. You're optimizing for the number on the scorecard.
And here's what really bothers me about that. Efficiency ratios reduce an organization to a single dimension. What share of dollars goes to programs? And in doing so, they actively penalize the things that make organizations resilient. Reserved, unrestricted capital, investment in infrastructure, and revenue diversification. All of those show up as costs, not as prudence. The watchdog framework is essentially grading organizations on how fast they spend their money, not whether they'll still be around in 5 years to keep doing the work.
You know, a private sector company maintaining a 6-month operating reserve is called well-managed, but a nonprofit doing the same thing is called wasteful. And there's something even deeper. Efficiency ratios can't capture what an organization does that isn't quantifiable. Save the Children's decade of field relationships in 115 countries, the fact that they were already embedded in Bangladesh when the floods hit, the institutional knowledge built up over a century of working in fragile states. None of that showing up in program expense ratios. A 99% program expense ratio at an organization that collapses in a year or two is worth less than 80% at one that's still there in year 20.
That is a structural failure in the accountability infrastructure around the entire sector. It's not a Save the Children problem. It's a how we evaluate nonprofits problem. The metric designed to protect donors from waste may have quietly pressured organizations towards fragility.
And finally, Jebb's Declaration of the Rights of the Child, drafted in 1923, adopted by the League of Nations in 1924, and became the foundation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, the most universally accepted human rights treaty in history. The U.S. still remains the only UN member state that has not ratified it, which puts the USAID funding in a particularly ironic light.
Save the Children in 2026. Is it still necessary? Is the business model still working?
The necessity question answers itself. 473 million children living in areas affected by conflict. 1 billion children lacking access to basic rights, nutritious food, clean water, and quality education. Climate change projecting hundreds of millions more in poverty by 2050. The problems Jebb responded to in 1919 haven't gone away. They've gotten more complex and more expensive.
Business model question is harder. The model that carried Save the Children from 1919 to 2024, such as government grants, child sponsorship, a federated structure, is under stress from multiple directions simultaneously. Government funding has become politically unstable, and individual child sponsorship has been retired. The federation consolidation is done, but still maturing.
What Save the Children has going for it is what it has always had. 107 years of demonstrated field presence, trusted relationships in 115 countries. The operational credibility that lets it respond within hours to a disaster because it's already there. You can't financial engineer your way to that. You earn it over a century, one program at a time.
And what SCGV is doing, building a child lens investing framework and seeding health tech and ed tech companies, finance, investing in prosthetics for child amputees in active conflict zones, the logic is the same. Find money that exists in the world and point it at children. In 2025, that's the impact investing market, estimated between $5 billion and $2.3 trillion.
But the gap between where SCGV is now and where it needs to be to fill in the USAID hole is enormous. And the urgency created by the collapse could push them towards decisions that compromise the model's integrity.
So here's where I land. Save the Children is a world-class humanitarian operator whose business model was never properly stress tested. The sponsorship model worked so well for so long that it masked the underlying fragility. And the government funding was so stable for so long that it looked like a foundation when it was actually a dependency. And the innovative finance arm is genuinely promising, but it's genuinely early.
Every one of those innovations, child sponsorship in 1920, the first full-page ad in 1919, the Vatican partnership, the Federation, all started as a bet that money existed in the world that hadn't yet been pointed at children, and that the right mechanism could unlock it. SCGV is the same bet, placed in a different capital market.
Think about where this started. There's a woman convicted in court, and the prosecutor who just convicted her reaches into his pocket and hands her £5 to pay her fine. That is the original Save the Children theory of change, that the right cause, presented with enough moral clarity, can turn its opponents into its funders. The prosecutor becomes the first donor. SCGV is a bet that the same thing is true of institutional capital markets, that the right framework, backed by 107 years of field credibility, can turn pension funds and insurers into the next generation of supporters who never knew that's what they were doing.
The question is whether they get there before the current crisis forces decisions that make it harder to arrive.
Thanks for listening to Impact.
See you next time.